And now part two. Be ready. Aaron kept his sons close, watching over them. We must wait on the Lord. The moment the cloud rises, we must move quickly. As the sun rose, the cloud rose and spread out over the camp. He watched it and saw it was moving. Eleazar, Ithamar, come. They headed quickly for the tabernacle. Don't forget the cloth. His sons took up the heavy chest and followed him inside the inner chamber. Removing the shielding curtain, he covered the Ark of the Covenant with it, and then covered it with heavy protective hides and spread a solid blue cloth over that. He slid the acacia wood poles into the golden rings. Feeling clumsy in his haste, Aaron tried to calm himself and remember the details of preparing for travel. At his instructions, Eleazar and Ithamar spread another blue cloth on the table of the presence and placed it on the plates, dishes, bowls, and placed on it the plates, dishes, bowls, and jars for the drink offerings. The bread of presence remained. Everything was covered by a scarlet cloth and then covered again with hides. The lampstand was covered with blue and wrapped along with the wick trimmers, trays, and jars for the oil. A blue cloth was spread over the gold altar. As soon as the ashes were removed and properly deposited, the bronze altar was covered with a purple cloth along with the utensils. When each item was properly stowed for travel, Aaron nodded. Summon the Kohathites. The Lord had assigned them to carry the holy things. The Gershonites were responsible for the tabernacle, and tent, its coverings, and the curtains. The Meronite clans were responsible for the crossbars, posts, bases, and all the equipment. The Lord moved out before them overhead. Moses followed, staff in hand. Those who carried the ark followed Moses. Aaron and his sons came next. Behind them, the multitude gathered in ranks with their tribes and proceeded in order. Eleazar watched the cloud. Where do you think the Lord will take us, Father? Wherever he wills. They traveled until late in the afternoon and the cloud stopped. The ark was set down. Aaron oversaw the rebuilding of the tabernacle and the raising of the curtains around it. He and his sons unwrapped each item carefully and placed it where it belonged. Eleazar filled the 7-branch lampstand with oil and prepared the fragrant incense. At twilight, Aaron made the offering before the Lord. As night came, Aaron stood outside his tent and surveyed the arid land by moonlight. There was a little pasturage here and no water. He knew they would be on the move again soon. In the morning, the cloud rose again, and Aaron and his sons went to work quickly. Day after day, they did this until Aaron and his sons moved with quick precision, and the people fell into order with a single blast of the shofar. One day, Aaron rose expecting to move, but the cloud remained. Another day passed, and another. When Aaron and his sons and the people settled easily, relaxing their vigil, the cloud rose again. As he walked, Aaron remembered the jubilance and celebration as they had left Egypt. Now the people were silent, stoic, as they began to realize the fullness of God's decree that they would wander the wilderness until the rebellious generation had died. They came to rest again after performing the evening sacrifice. Aaron joined Moses. That night, they ate together in silence. Aaron spent the entire day at the tabernacle performing his duties from dawn to dusk and overseeing that the others did as the Lord had bade them. He knew his brother had spent his day reviewing difficult cases and bringing them before the Lord. Moses looked tired. Neither felt like talking. They spent their days talking. Miriam served manna cakes. Perhaps we'll stay here for a time. There's plenty of grass and the animals and water. The cloud rose just as Aaron completed the morning sacrifice. Aaron swallowed his sorrow and called out his sons. Come, quickly. His sons hastened to him. The people rushed to their tents to make preparations for travel. They only traveled half a day this time and then remained camped in one place for a month. Does God tell you beforehand, Father? Eleazar walked beside Aaron, his eyes on the ark. Does God give you any indication that we will be moving? No, not even Moses knows the day and the hour. Ithamar hung his head. 40 years, the Lord said. We deserve our punishment, brother. If we had heeded Joshua and Caleb instead of the others, perhaps. Aaron felt such a heavy sorrow inside that he could hardly breathe past it. It came upon him so strongly, he knew it must be from the Lord. Oh, God, Do we understand your purposes? Will we ever understand? It is not merely punishment, my sons. Ithamar looked at him. What is it then, father? This endless wandering. Training. His sons looked perplexed. Eleazar looked acquiescent, but Ishmael shook his head. We move from one place to another like nomads with no home. We look like the outer purposes and think we understand. We look at the outer purposes and think we understand. But remember, my sons, God is merciful as well as just. Ithamar shook his head. I don't understand. Aaron sighed deeply, keeping his pace steady, his gaze straight ahead on the ark and Moses in the distance. We came through the Red Sea, but we brought Egypt with us. We have to let go of who we were and become who God intends us to be. Free? Eleazar said. I don't call this freedom. Aaron glanced at Ithamar. Do not question the Lord. You are free, but you must learn obedience. We must all learn. We became a new nation when God brought us out of Egypt, and the nations around watch us. But what have we done with our freedom but drag all the old ways with us? We must learn to wait on the Lord. Where I have failed, you must succeed. You must learn to keep your eyes and ears open. You must learn to move when God tells you to move and not before. One day the Lord will bring you and your children to the Jordan. And when God says, take the land, you must be ready to go in, take and hold it. Ithamar raised his head. We will be ready. The arrogant impetuousness of youth. I hope so, my son. I hope so. The years passed slowly as the Israelites wandered in the wilderness. The Lord always provided enough pasture for the animal. He gave the people manna and water to sustain them. Their shoes and clothing never wore out. Each day, Aaron arose from his pallet and saw the presence of the Lord in the cloud. Each night, before he entered his tent to rest, he saw the presence of the Lord in the pillar of fire. Year after year, the people traveled. Every morning and evening, Aaron offered sacrifices and fragrant offerings. He pored over the scrolls Moses wrote, reading them until he had memorized every word the Lord had spoken to Moses. As the high priest, Aaron knew he must know the law better than anyone else. The people of God had delivered from Egypt began to die. Some died at an early age. Others lived into their 70s and 80s, but the generation that had come out of Egypt dwindled, and the children grew tall. Aaron never let a day go by without instructing his children and grandchildren in the law of the Lord. Some of them had not been born when God brought the plagues upon Egypt. They never saw the Red Sea parted or walked on the dry land to reach the other side, but they gave thanks for the manna they received every day. They praised the Lord for the water that quenched their thirst, and they grew strong as they walked the wilderness and relied on the Lord for everything they needed to live. He's asking for you, Aaron. Aaron rose slowly, his joints stiff, his back aching. His grief deepened each time he sat with an old friend who was dying. Deepened and remained. There were so few left now, a mere handful of those who had worked in the mud pits and made bricks for Egypt. And Hur had been a good friend, one of those Aaron could trust to strive to do right. He was the last of the first 70 men chosen to judge the people. The other 69 now replaced by younger men, trained and chosen for their love of and adherence to the law. Hur lay on a pallet in his tent. His children and grandchildren gathered around him. Some wept softly, others sat in silence, head bowed. His eldest son sat close beside him, leaning down to hear his father's final instructions. Hur saw Aaron standing in the doorway of his tent. My friend! His voice was weak, his body emaciated by age and infirmity. He spoke softly to his son, and the younger man withdrew, making a place for Aaron. Hur raised his hand weakly. My friend. He squeezed Aaron's hand weakly. I am the last of those condemned to die in the wilderness. The 40 years are almost over. His hand felt so cold, the bones so fragile. Aaron put his hands around his as though he were holding a bird. Oh, Aaron, all these years of wandering, and I still feel the weight of my sin. It's as though the years have not diminished it, but removed my strength to endure it. His eyes were moist, but sometimes I dream of standing on the shores of the Jordan, looking across at the promised land. My heart breaks at the loss of it. It is so beautiful, not at all like this wilderness in which we live. All I can do is dream of the fields of grain and the fruit trees and the flocks of sheep and cattle, and hope my sons and their sons will soon sit under an olive tree and hear the bees humming. Tears trickled into his white hair. I am more alive when I am asleep than when I'm awake. Aaron fought the emotions gripping him. He understood what Hur was saying, understood with every fiber of his being. Regret for sins committed, repentance, 40 years of walking with the consequences. Hur let out his breath softly. Our sons are not as we were. They have learned to move when God moves and rest when he rests. Aaron closed his eyes and said nothing. You doubt. Aaron stroked his friend's hand. I hope. Hope is all we have left, my friend. And love. It had been a long time since Aaron had heard the voice. And he uttered a sob of gratitude, his heart yearning toward it, leaning in, drinking love as he whispered hoarsely, the Lord disciplines us as we discipline our sons, Hur. It may not feel like love when we're living in the midst of it, but love it is, hard and true, lasting. Hard and true, lasting. Aaron knew death was drawing near. It was time to withdraw. He had his duties to perform, the evening sacrifice to offer. He leaned close one last time. May the Lord's face shine upon you and give you peace. And you, when you sit beneath your olive tree, Aaron, think of me. Aaron paused outside the tent and let his mind wander to the past. He would always remember Hur standing on that hilltop with him, holding Moses' left hand in the air while he held his brother's right, and below them, Joshua defeating the Amalekites. He knew the moment Hur breathed his last. Clothes ripped, men sobbed, and the women keened. It was a sound oft heard in the camp over the years, but this time it brought with it a sense of completion. Their wandering was about to come to an end. A new day was coming. Aaron stood in his priestly garb before the curtain that hid the most holy place from sight. He shook as he always did when the Lord spoke to him. Even after 40 years, he'd not become accustomed to the sound within and without and all around him, the voice that filled his senses with delight and terror. You, your sons, and your relatives from the tribe of Levi will be held responsible for any offenses related to the sanctuary. But you and your sons alone will be held liable for violations connected with the priesthood. Bring your relatives of the tribe of Levi to assist you and your sons as you perform the sacred duties in front of the tabernacle of the covenant. But as the Levites go about their duties under your supervision, they must be careful not to touch any of the sacred objects or the altar. If they do, both you and they will die. Let it sink in and remain fresh in my mind, Lord. Don't let me forget anything. I myself have chosen your fellow Levites from among the Israelites to be your special assistants. Oh Lord, let them be men whose hearts are fixed on pleasing you. From the time of Jacob, we have killed men in anger. Cursed is our anger. It is so fierce, and we tend to cruelty, oh Lord, and now you are scattering us throughout Israel, just as Jacob prophesied. We are dispersing as priests among your people. Make us a holy nation. Give us tender hearts. I have put priests in charge of all the holy gifts that are brought to me by the people of Israel. I have given these offerings to you and your sons as your regular share. Let my life be an offering. Your priests will receive no inheritance of land or share of property among the people of Israel. I am your inheritance and your share. As for the tribe of Levi, your relatives, I will pay them for their service in the tabernacle with the tithes from the entire land of Israel. Aaron surrendered to the voice, listening, drinking in the words like living water. The Lord commanded that a red heifer without defect or blemish that had never been under a yoke be given to Eleazar to be taken outside the camp and slaughtered. Aaron's sons would take some of the blood on his finger and sprinkle it 7 times toward the front of the tent of meeting. The heifer was to be burned, the ashes collected and put into a ceremonial clean place outside the camp for use in the water of cleansing for purification from sin. So much to remember: the festival, the sacrifices, the laws. Aaron sat with Moses and looked out over the tents, the flickering lights of thousands of campfires. We're all that's left of the generation that left Egypt. 38 years had passed from the time they left Kadesh Barnea until they crossed the Zered Valley. The entire generation of fighting men had perished from the camp, and the Lord had sworn, as the Lord had sworn would happen. Just you, me, and Miriam. Surely now the Lord would turn toward the promised land. The cloud moved, and the whole community traveled with the Lord until he stopped over the desert of Zin. The people made a camp at Kadesh. While Aaron studied the scrolls, Miriam laid her hand on his shoulder. I love you, Aaron. I have loved you like a son. His sister had spoken very little since the Lord had afflicted her with leprosy, healed her, and commanded her to spend the 7 days cleansing outside the camp. She'd returned a different woman, tenderly patient, quiet. She served the family with her customary devotion, but kept her thoughts to herself. He was perplexed by her sudden need to say that she loved him. She went outside the tent and sat at the entrance. Troubled, Aaron rose and went out to her. Miriam? It is our own pride that slays us, Aaron. Aaron searched her face. Shall I send for Eleazar's wife to tend to you? She looked so old and worn down, her dark eyes soft and moist. Come closer, Aaron. She cupped his face and looked into his eyes. I have made terrible mistakes. I know, so have I. Her hands were cool, her fingers trembling. He remembered when she was robust and full of fire. He had learned long ago not to argue with his sister, but she was different now. Humiliated before all Israel, humbled before God, she had become strangely content when God had stripped her of the one thing she could not conquer, her pride. And the Lord forgave us both. Yes, she smiled and took her hands from him. She folded them in her lap. We contend with God, and he disciplines us. We repent, and he forgives. She looked up at the cloud moving in slowly undulating circles overhead. Only his love endures forever. Aaron felt a niggling fear growing inside of him. Miriam was slipping away. Fear gripped him. She was dying. Surely the Lord would allow Miriam to enter Canaan. If she was not spared, would he also die before they reached the Jordan River? He couldn't imagine life without his sister. She'd always been there for him from the time he was a little boy. She had been like a second mother, scolding and disciplining him, guiding and teaching him. At 8, she'd been bold enough to approach Pharaoh's daughter. Her quick thinking had brought Moses home for a few years before he was taken to the palace. He beckoned Ithamar. Bring Moses. Ithamar took one look at his aunt and ran. Aaron took Miriam's hand and tried to warm it between his. Moses will come. She was just tired. She'd be better soon. She would be refreshed after rest and rise again. Moses cannot stop what God has ordained, Aaron. Have I not been just as disobedient as the others of our generation who have died? It is just that I go the way of all flesh here in the wilderness. And what about me? The cloud changed from gray to gold, and from gold to a fiery orange and red as day became night. The Lord stood guard, giving them light and warmth by night, just as the Lord gave them shade during the heat of the day. I'm not afraid, Aaron. It's time. Don't talk that way, he rubbed her hand. The 40 years until we're all about to go into the promised land. Oh, Aaron, don't you understand yet? Moses hurried toward them, staff in hand. Aaron rose. Moses, please help her, please. She can't die. We're so close. Miriam, my sister. Moses knelt beside her. Are you in pain? Her mouth curved. Life is pain. The family gathered. Eleazar and Ithamar and their wives and children. Eleazar and Gershom sat with her. Moses' Cushite wife approached. Smiling, Miriam lifted her hand. They had long since made peace and become dear friends. Miriam spoke in a whisper, her strength ebbing. The Cushite woman wept and kissed Miriam's hand. Aaron was frantic with fear. This couldn't be happening. Miriam couldn't die yet. Hadn't she been the one to lead the people with songs of deliverance, songs of praise to the Lord? It was near dawn when Miriam sighed deeply. She died with her eyes still open and fixed upon the pillar of fire that now became the swirling gray cloud. Spears of sunlight came from it, making spots of light on the desert ground. With an anguished cry, Aaron reached toward her, only to be pulled back by Eleazar. You can't touch her now, Father. A high priest could not allow himself to become unclean. He would be unfit to perform his duties for all the people as their high priest. Sobbing, Aaron straightened with difficulty. Father, Eleazar supported him. It is time for the morning sacrifices. Aaron heard the harshness of his own voice and did not regret it. Is this the kindness of God to allow his sister to live so long and then to have her die so close to the borders of the promised land? You never forget our sins, do you, Lord? Never. Grieving and angry, he walked away as his sons' wives and servants began the warbling scream of grief. People nearby heard and came running. Soon, the entire camp was wailing. And that's the end of part 2 of chapter 6.